Minnesota is home to two of the most livable cities, the most beautiful natural scenery, and one of the most industrious, creative cultures in the world. In recent years, a thriving democracy of checks, balances, and an adversarial media have been replaced by political rivalries and corrupt officials, more focused on delivering for donors and interest groups than honoring the public trust. Increasingly, local media seems in lockstep with this enterprise. In the spring of 2020, this system broke down and sent shockwaves throughout the country. MNQuiry is not about politics. It is about the breakdown in transparency and accountability to the public, and what can be done to bring sustainable balance back to Minnesota government.
When you look at government versus all the problems that we're confronting on a global basis, you begin to figure out that our democratic government here in the United States and on the state level as well is not organized for the problems of today. Most of our government is based on the New Deal and the Cold War. Today, for instance, we're fighting problems of climate change, cyber attack, and the very, very serious and compelling issue of whether or not our democratic institutions, frankly, are for sale for private interests. And it's the latter that today is going to dominate our discussion. So I'm delighted to turn this back over to Paul Ostro, who served as president of the Minneapolis City Council and has been one of Minnesota's stronger thought leaders. Paul?
Thank you, Governor. It's really an honor to have you with us today. Your career certainly has been dedicated in many ways to integrity in public service, which is really what our program tries to be about. And to folks that are dedicating their lives to integrity in public service and serving the public, not private interests, are with us today. First, we have with us today the Executive Director of Common Cause Minnesota, Anastacia Belladonna-Carrera. Welcome.
Good morning.
And then also we have with us someone who has a job title that would intimidate almost anyone, and that is Beth Rotman, who is the National Director of Money in Politics and Ethics in Politics. Certainly two incredibly important topics. And so we look forward to your thoughts, Beth, on how we put our concerns in Minnesota into a national perspective. And Anastacia, I want to start with you, if you could. You were recently quoted in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune raising some very significant concerns about the lack of transparency in St. Paul. And could you comment on those concerns and also how that relates to the concerns you have with the dominance of money in politics and private interest?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for allowing my participation on such an important topic. Thank you all. Governor, thank you so much for always being that voice on this as well, to sort of sound the alarm whenever that is needed. The context of my comments to the reporter that day had to do with the negotiations of $52 billion, historic amounts that literally was happening between three individuals. And of course, those three individuals was Speaker Hortman, Senate Majority Leader Paul Gazelka, and of course the governor. Now that's not anything outside of the ordinary that we know as Minnesotans, right? You've experienced that in the past and people have been upset about that in the past. But what was particularly concerning that day was that I was watching a press conference from Senate Majority Leader Gazelka, where he for the first time talked about pocket agreements that apparently were wink, verbally agreed to, allegedly, but had not been in fact been reported on or disclosed by these three trusted local leaders to the public. And so again, even though we're used to some of the sexy politics stuff, right? There's always, our job is to always shine the light, right? Their job is to continue to do what it is that they do, that they feel gets constituents' voices out there. The bottom line is that this isn't like we're not at the Capitol. I'm not able to pound on doors. I'm not able to speak to LA's legislative assistants. I'm not able to jump into Majority Leader Winkler's office and say, hey, I heard this. Is this true? You know, normally we're able to get a semblance of that transparency, but this is not normal times. And we are left to gadgets like this, right, that don't speak back to us. And now we can't even really trust what is being reported by these three trusted voices, because then we turn around and hear that there are these pocket agreements. Well, Speaker Hartman poo-pooed all of what Senator Gazalka was saying, but at the end of it, though, the reporters are really dogged about continuing to ask, but where would this come from? Like, why would he just say something like that, right? And she finally did admit that there had been some agreements that were not reported back. And that to me is deeply disturbing. It's disturbing when I look at Twitter and see elected officials sitting in an empty hearing room asking, hey, does anybody out there know what's going on? Because I don't. And if we're electing our officials to be the people's voice, and they are locked out because a very, very coveted few are divvying out $52 billion, then where is the people's voice? Who are these individuals that get to have those cherished positions?
Well, let me ask you this. This is precisely what the problem is. The truth of the matter is we should have seen this coming years and years ago, because it raises a much broader question, and that is, who actually owns our government? Back in 1976, the caucuses raised a little over $100,000. That was the four caucuses used their strength to raise a little over $100,000. Last year, they raised over $16 million. The truth of the matter is, when you look at the enormity of special interest money coming into the coffers of the legislature, we ought not to be surprised, one, that there's a consolidation of power, and two, it wants to operate in secrecy. And that's precisely what's happening.
And I think the point you're making too, Anastacia, is this secrecy is a secrecy that is keeping the vast majority of even legislators in the dark.
Correct.
As to what is going on. So Governor, I want to go back to you, and then Beth, I'd love a bit of a national perspective, but what a lot of people say to me over and over again is, Paul, you're such an idealist. You're so naive. This has always been the way it's been. Things have always been corrupt, and a few people have always done. So put a lie to that, Governor. Could you have done this when you were governor?
No, absolutely. How is it? Under the current system, frankly, we can reduce the legislature to 8 people. We don't need the rest. But bear in mind, every single one of those legislators consented to this new system of secrecy and consolidation of power and the incredible enormity of special interest money. Bear in mind, I think this may well be the first time that this has been revealed to the public. Every senator, for instance, in the Minnesota state legislature over the past 4 years had on average approximately $230,000 available to him via caucus fundraising. This caucus fundraising is a fundamental conflict of interest because it does mean that public policy is for sale. Two, it launders a lot of what we call special interest money, but also dark money. So when you hear legislators and politicians, congressmen, et cetera, say, I don't accept PAC money, that's not true. They thrive on it. It's just been laundered. And thirdly, it builds for a consolidation of power. It empowers the leaders of the 4 caucuses and perhaps one assistant to fundamentally decide what passes and what does not pass.
Beth, could you give us a national perspective on the issues of dark money, the issues of caucus fundraising, How does Minnesota fit in nationally? Are we an outlier here, or are these issues you're seeing all over the country?
Well, unfortunately, Minnesota is not an outlier, but there is some good news. I think that it's clear that this is a time for bold, comprehensive change. It's something that Common Cause and our colleagues and advocates across the country are working very, very hard on, both nationally and in states across the country. Right now, there's a lot of activity, and I'm sure that many of your listeners have heard of the For the People Act. There has been a lot of activity around this. This is a very sweeping, once-in-a-generation piece of legislation that really is putting together a lot of important pieces of legislation. It includes reforms on some of the problems that we're talking about right now, including more disclosure and transparency, shutting down some of the special interest fundraising, getting back at some of the foreign interference in our elections, making it easier to vote, tackling gerrymandering. I mean, that is just the tip of the iceberg. But I want to talk a little bit more about one thing that's very important. This isn't just that some people sat down and said, oh, this would be a good idea. Let's try to pass this nationally. How this is working is that these are all reforms that are already working in a handful at least of states. So it's taking some of the best of what's working in at least a handful of states across the country, and then trying to pass that also in more states and nationally. So I've worked in the city of New York, I've worked in the state of Connecticut, and now I have the honor of working at Common Cause, trying to help our 35 state chapters. So I can tell you there are a lot of great reforms in a lot of states. No one's perfect, but we tackle a lot of these issues. So there's actually a lot we can do to fight these problems. And I'm really glad we're talking about this in Minnesota, because there's a lot more we can do together in Minnesota as well. And I know that you all are already on your way there.
Well, let me ask you this. I don't know. First of all, it's not being discussed in Minnesota, and that's very disturbing. We used to be at the center, if you will, of all these political reforms. Now we're way back in the rear. But aside from that, why do we allow legally, and you're an attorney, having a caucus raise money from special interests that have legislation pending before the legislature constitutes, to me, the most gross form of conflict of interest?
Governor, I think you raised an excellent point. I think you raised an excellent point. I'm sorry, Anastacia, I don't want to cut you off, but I will tell you something, Governor. I've been talking with a lot of states lately, and it is a problem that I will tell you that one way or another, even though it's not the exact same problem with the caucus committees, but I will tell you that it's state to state by state. I will tell you, honestly, it is one of the hardest problems to fix because, as you know, as the governor and as a leader in the state, because the caucus committees are made up of the leaders of the state, and they're the ones that have to pass the fixes, and it gets at their own power. These are not the changes that they want to make. It is some of the hardest power to sort of wrench away. It can be done, but I will tell you that in state after state, it is often the hardest change to make.
Okay, that's precisely the point we should get at. We allow incumbents to draft the election laws and the conditions under which those elections are held and the funding of those elections and how it's done. That's a fundamental conflict of interest. We, the public, should have the right to decide the district lines, the size of the legislature, how legislators are elected, and how they are funded. We can't sit back and say, well, gee, we threw the problem inside the box, and the inside the box finds it terribly inconvenient to make changes. Because if we stay on this current course, we're not going to have a democracy. And right now we don't. Right now we have an oligarchy that's centered on the influence of powerful money interests.
Well, and to the governor's point, I think my experience in the time that I've been with Common Cause Minnesota dealing with money in politics started out with the attack from, at the time, the Republican leadership to dismantle public subsidy and dismantle the tax rebate programs that really go towards putting power back into the people, which is what the governor's talking about. And one of the things that we faced at that time was not just taking on and working hard to mobilize grassroots to protect it, which thank God we were able to do despite Republican leadership in both chambers at the time. But part of it was the real muzzling of the campaign finance executive director, in that at the time, Senator Kiffmeyer really was also trying to, wink, wink, go after the budget. That was one way that they sort of put a muzzle on the one office that does have the ability to do some of the things that Governor Carlson just spoke to, right? And really go and flex their muscle, right? Their good government muscle. But when the budget is being controlled by the very people that the agency is supposed to be bird dogging or, watching, right? It becomes another issue and another barrier. And I would even add to that the other aspect of that is that it is the legislative body that ultimately agrees to who the board members are going to be on that body. And so what happened was that they refused, no matter how good the candidate was, they refused to approve of the candidate and therefore left the board, not just under the threat of being defunded in a way, to the point where they're crippled in their investigative functions, right? When they get complaints, but they can't even move rules off of their agency because they don't have the quorum that's legally necessary to do so. And that was something that we particularly tried to take on during that time when there was a bill moved by, interestingly enough, both the House and the Senate. It had a DFL chief in the House and a Republican chief in the Senate, because the governor at the time was under this sort of agreed upon standard that if it wasn't bipartisan and it had to do with elections or voting, that they would not agree to it. It was sort of from the Pawlenty time, and Governor Dayton sort of, went along with the same kind of, rule of sorts, right? And that bill, what it did to address what the governor's talking about with regards to dark money and ALEC. ALEC is a name that we need to start talking about in this conversation. If we're going to talk about dark money and special interests and the whole Koch brother network, right? That's another layer to who these players are. But putting that issue aside for now, going back to how this thing works, there was language that allowed for super PACs and candidates or parties to share the list. You know how parties will have events and they write down a list? Well, now in Minnesota, they're actually able to share that information. And when we went against it and testified against it, I believe the league also testified against the same thing. In fact, I tried to get Senator Carlson to not, as the minority ranking leader in the committee, agree to it, and he actually supported it. And the reason we got was because it was trying to help base build for parties. Bull! It wasn't base building for parties. The next election cycle, to Governor Carlson's point, we almost doubled the amount of campaign money just swarming the state of Minnesota over key districts to historic numbers, and many of that was independent expenditures. And
I think it's a very interesting analysis. So let me just be overly blunt, if I may. I came up, as you all know, as a Republican, a so-called moderate Republican. Basically had to run against my own party in order to become governor. Had a Democratic legislature, but we got an awful lot done because, frankly, working with them was a delight. But what we have now in America, both on the national and local level, is one political party that wants to create an autocratic government. And let's not kid ourselves. That's what it's all about. Voter suppression, etc. That means we have to rely on the Democratic Party for reforms. But now the Democratic Party in Minnesota is taking up the same bad habits that the Republicans did. They love special interest funding. They love caucus fundraising. And they love making deals so that public policy is compromised for the well-being of the special interests. And let's not kid ourselves, that's what it's about. And we see this with water quality. When I came out in 1957, you couldn't miss the Hamm's beer ads. From the land of sky blue waters, that was Minnesota. A large part of our economy was built around the health of our physical environment. People came here to have vacations, to hunt, to fish, but to celebrate the pristine environment that Minnesota had. Now, something like 57% of all of our lakes and rivers are, quote, compromised, if not polluted. The situation is growing worse. We have 2 mining operations that want to dump their poisonous effluent into the BWCA and into Lake Superior, and we can't get a single hearing in the Minnesota State Legislature on it, from a House that's controlled by the Democrats and a Senate that's controlled by Republicans. And Governor Walz is 100% behind the mining establishment. I would ask our viewers to go onto Google and Google 2 of the most internationally corrupt companies. One is Antofagasta, and the other is Glencore. And ask yourself, why would anybody with an IQ of 40 and any sense of values of decency even be dealing with these kinds of companies? They make the mafia look quite acceptable. And yet we're giving them control of our water. And the public is not entitled to a single public hearing. When the medical community, including the Mayo Clinic, petitioned Governor Dayton and asked for at least some kind of input on the health of that water that affects the drinking water of the Fond du Lac tribe and the people of Duluth, his answer was no. And Governor Walz gave exactly the same answer. So we've got to decide, how do we fight this? We should be discussing full campaign financing by the public and zero from special interests. Otherwise, the people will not have any say in their own government.
And Beth, there seems to be nationally a breakdown in...
I mean, what was the last thing you said we should be discussing?
We should be discussing full campaign financing by the public. It's cheaper. The outcomes are much more democratic, and it preserves, frankly, the best instincts of our society. And that allows us to focus. Right now, people are by a whole variety of problems, and they see no response coming from government except surprise. And how dare a former governor say that he couldn't support a bill when he himself and his administration should be initiating the legislation? We don't elect governors to become followers. We elect them to provide leadership.
Yeah, go ahead, Beth. You wanted to jump in.
I agree with what you said. I agree with what you said, Governor, and I'll tell you that we're happy to support you. I'm happy to support you from the national side, and I will tell you, I know that others beyond Common Cause are going to be happy to work with you too. That Minnesota is an important state. It's also a place where I very much agree with you that it was a place that was seen in the past as a leader, and then unfortunately became a place that where I think much like the federal system, when certain reforms that passed years ago sort of weren't updated and then weren't used, some of the reforms that passed years ago, it sort of became, not effective. I had the honor of being the founding director of the state of Connecticut's citizen-funded election program that ran first it passed in passed in 2005. It ran first with the legislature in 2008 and statewide in 2010. I did a very deep dive looking at the first 10 years of implementation after I got to Common Cause. So I looked at its first 10 years of implementation because I wanted to look at the question, one that I think you just actually raised, and about whether you really get different policies from these programs. I think that some folks had looked at these questions already of whether you get maybe more people to run for office, whether you get special interest money out. And I think we knew you get some special interest money out. We knew you get more diverse candidates. These are important goals. No one really looked at whether you actually also get better policies. I was looking specifically at that. And I will tell you that you do get better policies. Very timely also for the global pandemic that we've been facing in this country, that Connecticut became the first state in the country to pass statewide health care for service workers, and a whole slew of other policies that many people testified and could sort of explain would not have happened without these sweeping reforms. And add to it that even though many people will push back against these reforms and say, oh, we shouldn't be paying for this, we can't afford this. I will tell you, Governor, that after this report was released, people that are much more into the numbers, the sort of people that love to dig through the tax records of the state way more than I do, those reporters got into it after they got my report, and they uncovered things that led them to release their own articles. I'll share them with you, that said their conservative estimate is that after this program passed in the state, that in the money saved and not giving sort of extra random benefits to corporations just because of all their lobbyists, probably saved around $370 million in not just giving favors to corporations a year. That's $370 million a year just in not giving extra tax breaks. And that's in addition to, by the way, one bill that I tracked that saved one bill $24 million a year. I tracked it over 10 years. That's $240 million. That's one bill. Anyway, so these programs lead to better policy, save the state money, return the government to the people. And anyway, they're certainly not what's happening in all of the states, but they're happening in some of the states. And very, very excited and happy to be talking with you about it and to try to make some forward movement in Minnesota.
Anastacia, why aren't we seeing any movement in Minnesota? And what I'm just wondering what, if any, bills were produced. We can't even get our legislature, for example, to require that they comply with the Data Practices Act. Something as basic as that. So right. What is it about the Minnesota culture that's changed since you were there, Governor, that is making us lagging behind? And how can we accomplish what states like Connecticut have done? Montana, I know, has done some incredibly progressive things. And you say that here and everyone thinks you're crazy, but Montana is miles and miles ahead of Minnesota.
Colorado, New Jersey.
Absolutely. So was anything even introduced this session? Was anything ever given a hearing this session that would be a For the People Act in Minnesota?
So what you just, okay, so I'm going to unravel because you hit the nail on various angles. And so I'm going to try to unbundle that for your listeners. And one of the things that you hit on is the same thing that Governor Carlson has been beating the drums on, right? So before we can get to what reforms have been introduced, we need to understand the context, right? So one of the key things to responding to your question is this. We did have, as a matter of fact, a sort of baby for the People's Act bill called House File 9. And Representative Emma Greenman was the champion behind that. But this is what happens. Politics. What do I mean by that? Well, you put a bill together that has some awesome, actually, and it really did, has some awesome campaign finance reforms and just other things that helped set the stage for a more concentrated effort, right? Because you're never going to go in there and get everything. So you got to go in there and be strategic about how it is you're going to chip at that wall, right? But then you couch that bill with all kinds of wackadoodle other stuff that will never, is dead on arrival. It's just dead on arrival. But you make it sound like we're moving reforms, right? Well, are you really? Because you know what? To Governor Carlson's point, folks have got a few brain cells to rub together. And when they initially sat down and drafted that bill, they knew from the beginning it was symbolic at best. I don't do symbolism in Common Cause. And I don't know if Beth has heard about me in our state calls on that, but I don't do symbolic bills. If I'm going to move something, I'm going to move it. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to be strategic. I'm going to be laying it out. And I'm going to make sure that I am hitting every single corner that I can with a bill that I think has actually got a chance. So as far as whether we had one, we really did not have a bill that had that feasibility, despite the fact that had that bill been unbundled and had those good chunks been taken out of that, then we would have been able to really rally some energy behind that. So that's one layer to your question about, well, what's happening in Minnesota? How come the most progressive state and the most, voter-friendly state really is not doing really well? Part of the problem is the same people that Governor Carlson is talking about. You can't leave, what is that, the wolf guarding the hen house? You can't leave it up to those folks to come up with that. The other problem with that is lack of education. Our voters, we're grassrooting. In order to really corner people, and what did I say in the beginning about how despite having a Republican-controlled House and a Republican-controlled Senate, Common Cause rallied our base and we killed, right, their bills to dismantle public subsidy. That took a lot of grassroots. Common Cause is about mobilizing community, mobilizing everyday Minnesotans to take back the power that Governor Carlson is talking about. And we were able to do that because we were able to educate the community about what was going on. And to Governor Carlson's point, though, that education piece is just not happening at the grassroots level. It's happening with us, and thanks to you now, your listeners. But I think that's the other part of that, is that you can't hold power accountable if you don't understand the problem or what your role is in fixing that problem. And that's the part that I'm excited about partnering with Governor Carlson on, moving forward to the next legislative biennium, is how do we build that campaign? And I'll be reaching out to Beth, our national expert on that. What are we going to do to mobilize that grassroots component that we need and really champion? Because this is the one thing that does not have partisan delineations. It's got political delineations, but not when it comes to like redistricting, not when it comes to everyday Minnesotans. My table was next to the Trump table, was next to the Republican table, was next to the Democratic table. And after people went through them on the county fairs when we did that around redistricting reform, guess where they always landed and signed my sheet? At my table. Because redistricting, just like money in politics and the Koch brothers and their networks, and people need to know about that. Once we have the opportunity to do that, I do believe that we're going to have robust support, just like we did with redistricting on it. Now, what kept us from moving redistricting? The same people that are stopping. Representative Halverson moved the Minnesota Disclose Act. And this was in 2018. The Minnesota Disclose Act did exactly what Governor Carlson is trying to dismantle. And Representative Halverson, actually, if y'all know her from the legislature, she actually had good bipartisan political equity within the caucuses. Like, she wasn't a divisive, legislator. She definitely was someone advocating for her beliefs and her position. I'm not trying to paint her as, a quasi-Republican by any means, but she was able to bring people to the table. They acted like she was on some kind of, something when she tried to move this bill. And needless to say, she was not successful in moving.
I think at that point, we should stop and pause, because that's the key point. There's two parts to this. One is the part that you show the public. You see, we got all these bills that look good. The other part is the part of money. The moment Halverson comes up with that bill, she runs into that stone wall called $16 million of monies funded by the special interests. That wall prevails. I'll give you just a second example. On the waterfront, we wanted a hearing. We had 35 members of the DFL caucus in the House sign on to the bill. That's 1/2 of the caucus, including the former assistant majority leader and the current assistant majority leader, and we couldn't get a hearing. And to this day, the speaker won't utter a word as to why. But the answer we get is, we visit the speaker says no, and that's the end of it. And there's no willingness to buck the leadership. And the reason there's no willingness is because they run into that $16 million wall. And that's just 1 year of fundraising. Think about it. Paul, when you were running for office, how much did it cost you to run for the city council?
I think the most money I ever raised in a city council race was $23,000.
Okay. When I ran, which was 1970, it was about $5,000 to $6,000. Now, in those days, the Democrats were dependent upon what they called the DFL bean feed. And they would sell tickets for $5. You could eat an unlimited supply of beans and listen to one of their national or statewide figures talk. The Republicans were much more fancy. We had $100 a plate dinner, and we got a national figure to come in. Now, those two items are basically non-existent today. Not when you can get the thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars easily from the special interests that have legislation before the legislature. It's pay to play. It's in full swing. I think we should take a hard look at that Connecticut plan and see how far it goes. Because I'll tell you one thing, I'm very impressed with the number of Connecticut leaders that I see in the Senate and the House. It's an impressive group you've got out there. And I think that the pendulum has swung. Minnesota is not only not a leader in political reform, it's at the bottom.
Anastacia, how do we do in Minnesota what they did in Connecticut?
So before I get into that part of what we can explore and looking at those models, I wanted to just shed some light, because the governor just said some pretty powerful things, and I just wanted to make sure that the audience has a very solidified sense of what that really means for us. So following the 2018 elections, researchers from the Hubert Humphrey and the University of Minnesota's Political Science Department, they actually analyzed the activities of 7 House committees, like Minnesota House committees, and they examined this in particular. They wanted to see what, if any, ties existed between campaign donations and legislative activity, right? So here's this, group from the Hubert Humphrey, and they just wanted to see, are there any breadcrumbs that we can objectively document between campaign donations and legislative activity? And these are some of the things that they found. So they found that people who made campaign donations to committee members had 3 types of influence. This is what their report documented. They had access to the committee. They had promotion of their interest in public hearings. So the folks that were being allowed to come to the table for the coveted, 1 to 2 minutes average, these folks got longer time, right, at the table. And the opportunity to actually shape committee decisions because they were able to provide information that promoted their interest. So it's not just Governor Carlson saying, hey, I'm thinking this and this and this. This is an actual study that these groups, this team of professors and from academia, from the Hubert Humphrey University, the University of Minnesota, were actually able to connect the dots between that. And when Governor Carlson talks about, like, you know, the per plate costs and what have you, I actually jotted down the numbers from that report. They looked at, in 2016, the Minnesota House, this is just Minnesota House numbers, I'm not even going to go into the presidential. Minnesota House campaign, House and Senate, spent $32 million in 2016. And in 2020, that number increased by almost 10 million more. That's just in a House race. That's not including the presidential or the federal races where you're looking at the US House or the Senate House. So it's not just us sitting around and saying, well, I think, right? In my experience. No, this has been documented. The amount of inflooding of campaign outside of Minnesota. And that's the other key thing. We have outside of Minnesota. This isn't just our version of the Koch brothers donating to folks, right? And our version of the Koch brothers would be like a Stan Hubbard, right? The mega billion donor in the state of Minnesota, owns KSTP. It's not the Robert Cummings, you know, one of the most powerful Republican donor. I think they even dub him like the sugar daddy, is what I've been told by some folks, you know, because he's known. These are two folks that I consider like our local Koch brothers that use their power and money to influence policies that are cranking out of our legislature. We've got well over a dozen Minnesota House state representatives that are ALEC members. We've got at least 5 that I can track anyway that are in our Senate. Senator Kiffmeyer is the chair for Minnesota's ALEC. Representative Garofalo is the chair for Minnesota for ALEC. I mean, it's much more bigger than just people giving an opinion. It's not just Governor Carlson giving his opinion about something. It's something that's being documented. So in regards to what model, like whether what Beth attempted to do in Connecticut would be something that would work here in Minnesota, the way I approach those types of solutions is the following. My experience, and Governor, I'm interested in what you think about this as well, but my experience in organizing grassroots in Minnesota is that our Minnesota constituent is not the average, you know, extremely polarized constituent. Our constituent doesn't like, you know, like negativity from one side or the other. They tend to be very open to information, but they also don't like cookie cut type things. So what I do, like even with just our redistricting campaign, is that I reach out to the folks that have really done a good job moving it, like in this case, Beth, amazing in Connecticut. I would meet up with Beth. I'd meet up with, put together like a team of folks and just talk about it. Like, is this something that's going to function based on where our constituency is at? First of all, with regards to understanding the issue. Secondly, is the issue the same? Is the dynamics behind what happened in Connecticut the same as what's happening here in Minnesota? Because to Governor Carlson's point, I really agree. The old narrative around, you know, Republicans are trying to do this and that and the other because they're just trying to is not really the same now in Minnesota, in my experience. And when I'm looking at those numbers, like the report that came out of the Hubert Humphrey, they literally tracked this from the 2018 election to the 2020 election, and even reverted back to some information they got from 2016. This is not a Republican problem. This is a power problem. This is a special interest power problem, not necessarily a partisan problem. And so I would have to learn more about, you know, how Beth went about laying it out in Connecticut.
Paul, if I may, Minnesota has gone through some changes that we have not been able to comment on, and they're terribly important. When you go back to the 1950s and the 1960s, Minnesota was a state that was trying desperately to be discovered. We regarded ourselves as a flyover state. And toward that end, there was a coalition of leadership that was built. It was built largely, oddly enough, by the business community. These were largely business leaders who were born, raised in Minnesota, and ran Minnesota companies and wanted to build a Minnesota community. 2, the Cowles family owning the Star Tribune really dedicated to the proposition that Minnesota could be a lead state. And they invested enormous sums of money in order to attract top flight reporters and columnists and editorial writers. And they became one of America's most influential newspapers. And then they built a coalition called the Citizens League that you're familiar with. But that league consisted of the CEOs, the top labor leaders, and then political leadership. And they huddled weekly on building the various systems and the various policies that were necessary to build Minnesota. Metropolitan governance, for instance, came out of that group. All of that is now gone. The business leadership consists of people that were born, raised elsewhere, are not as committed to the Minnesota community as their predecessors. The Star Tribune has been sold, and it's in the process of being resold again, and it's a shadow of its former self. And the result is the broad oversight function is now absent. So it's easier for mischief to occur without the fear of being exposed. And that's precisely what we're going through right now. And we have to figure out what's the substitute. I take slight exception to the idea that we can work this strictly from the grassroots. I'm a believer in candidates. I think it's got to be within the reform of the DFL, and I think there's got to be some competitive challenges for not just the legislature, but for the governor, and have people run on the platform that we're talking about. And that's the way you're going to stir up a public debate. There's got to be a confrontation from business being conducted the way it currently is, which is a catering, if you will, to the special interests, and a challenge on behalf of the people and the people's interests.
So I'm a part of a group called No Labels, and it's dedicated to what we call problem-solving politics. And it seems to me, Governor, that politics is just theater. It's like wrestling. It's all theater. And so little attention gets paid to just solving the problem. You know, I was a part of a group that filed a lawsuit last week against the city of Minneapolis for systemically keeping police discipline records private. That had one day in the headlines and then was quickly replaced by all the political theater. So I'm using that as an example because how did we get Derek Chauvin? We got it because of a systemic failure of actually administering government, of actually solving problems. And that gets so little attention. And I think that also does that. To me, the political theater and the extent of the partisan divide provides cover, really, for this kind of interest-based politics, because people, Governor, my sense is we don't even hold elected officials. We don't even expect elected officials to solve problems anymore. We just expect elected officials to perform the kind of theater that we like to see them perform.
Right. But before we get into this endless explanation of why we can't do something, let's focus on what we can do.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And what we can do is try to encourage younger, aggressive, principled candidates to run for public office and be willing to challenge within their own party. Let's recognize the obvious. The Republicans are not going to lead any reforms except those that move us more and more towards an autocratic system. That means the Democratic Party has to be the people's party, and right now it's moving in the opposite direction. It needs challenges inside the DFL. We should be trying to seek younger, talented, outspoken candidates that can provide that leadership. We've done it in the past. There's no reason why we can't do it again. But we can't afford to sit down as a nation or as a state and intellectualize on the problem. We have to start focusing on real people that are willing to challenge, because candidates do get attention. Candidates are not just yesterday's story. And we got to start to encourage all those that are sitting this one out to get in. And I mean that. The University of Minnesota is sitting this one out. They should be sponsoring debates. They should be concerned about the autocratic tendencies in the United States instead of wallowing in silence for fear of offending Trump contributors. The business community should be far more outspoken than it currently is. And it should be speaking not about their immediate economic interest, but about the long-term well-being of society, a society that allows them to thrive and to succeed on the long-term basis. But we need leadership, and that's the one thing we're not seeing.
What was the leadership where this has happened? What type of political leadership was involved?
You had all sorts of leadership. You had the leadership of Hubert Humphrey. You had the leadership of Dean McCarthy. You had Walter Mondale. You had Harold Stassen. And we had a whole bunch of Republican leaders that led serious transitions and built us. But those leaders didn't sit back and say, let's explain the problem and become a victim of the problem. No, they said, no, we can lead. Why isn't there even in the DFL a discussion of challenging what we're talking about today? Not one single Democrat is willing to hold a news conference and talk about this problem. And I don't think you can succeed in getting one of them to come on this show.
Because there's a $230,000 check that guarantees the re-election we're getting from the caucus.
Thank you. There you go. There you go. Exactly right. Nobody wants to challenge the presence of money.
Beth, what was the leadership in Connecticut? What has been the leadership? Has it come from the governor? Has it come from legislators? Has it been grassroots? Where there has been success, how has that manifested itself?
Well, I mean, sweeping change like the one that came about with the sweeping reforms I talked about is very often because of a huge scandal. So this was certainly the case in Connecticut, where we had Governor Rowland, who was convicted of several crimes, accepting essentially various kinds of fraud and bribery crimes from state contractors, and went to jail. Also, a state treasurer had also been convicted of various fraud-related crimes. And there was a lieutenant governor who came into power and basically adopted a mandate of being ethical and passing reform, and basically said to a Republican lieutenant governor that came in and spoke with a Democratic-led legislature and said, you know, you've been saying you want this kind of reform. They had been passing some citizen election programs, which they always knew would be vetoed by a Republican governor. And they said, you know, you've been saying you want this. Well, I want restrictions on contributions from people with contracts with the state. And I want certain other things. This was the lieutenant governor who came in with her boss off to jail. And it was not simple, and it took incredible grassroots organizing, but there was a lot of also coalitions with unlikely sort of I shouldn't say unlikely, but not just good government coalition people. I mean, it was very, very broad coalitions working on this together. It takes more than scandal, obviously. And sweeping reforms passed, and part of what made it so comprehensive was, in addition to giving the subsidies from the government to run for office, there was also all of this sort of clamping down on the other sort of big money. So restrictions on money from people with lucrative contracts with the states, and restrictions on money from lobbyists. So there was just a lot of turning off the spigots from where money usually came with too. But it honestly was a pretty huge organizing campaign. It's difficult to see ones that, you know, aligned to be that large. That said, I've seen other reforms pass. We've seen a lot of reforms pass. For example, recently, all across the state of Maryland, there have been a lot of municipal reforms, and they just passed for statewide citizen-funded elections. They've also passed in the state of New York without campaigns that were quite so huge. So we've seen reforms like this pass without something that was quite such the perfect storm. So the Connecticut one was pretty huge, but I have to say we've seen a lot of programs pass since then without something quite so dramatic. So it can happen. It can be done.
I know.
Paul, to this point, the broad we who do want reforms, we've been handed, and just in the last week alone, incredible opportunities to entice candidates to run on. Corporations are paying an effective rate of 11.3%. I'd love to have that tax rate. The biggest corporations, including Nike and FedEx, pay absolutely zero. Billionaires are paying at a rate of, I think it's roughly 4.3%, some paying absolutely zero. If that isn't an issue, I don't know what is. But those are results of very favorable outcomes from the result of the influence of special interest money into the system. And what the special interest money is doing, it's not allowing itself to be isolated. It works as a conglomerate, a team. And that is, yes, we'll protect the mining industry, we'll protect our tax interests, we'll protect our market dominance interest. They will protect the totality of their interest. And frankly, to dole out $16 million to buy a legislature, that's not a lot of money. But what we need here is a sense of outrage instead of a constant surrender to it. Later on today, I'm going to be at a podcast at the law school of the University of Pennsylvania. But again, looking at the agenda, it's all about let's wax on a bill that can't pass, as opposed to seizing the moment and the opportunity and then asking tough questions of ourselves. Where's the leadership of our universities? They're the highest paid public employees that we have on the administrative side. And overall, as a class of people, they're very, very silent as America is going through some of its most serious attacks on its own democracy.
Everyone's talking about the Washington situation. And I want to talk about the Minnesota situation.
Yeah, it's all over. You're right.
Because that's where we can have the biggest impact. So, Anastacia, what I'd like to see is an HF1 and an SF1 in 2022 that we collectively advocate for and take the offense. And you can come up with a better name for it, but I'm going to call it the Rebirth of Democracy in Minnesota Act. All right? And how do we get that done in the moments we have left? How do we engage people that are listening or watching to be a part of that effort and to partner with all of us in that effort heading into this fall and into an election year next year?
Well, I certainly am not one to shy away from a challenge. So I completely embrace your friendly call to action. We had already Common Cause Minnesota convenes multi-partisan, multi-layered coalition space called the Minnesota Alliance for Democracy. And in that space, we have activists, we have regular grassroots groups that are not 501c3s. You know, technically, we've got nonprofits, we've got a whole gamut of different people from, all over the state. And one of the things that we do is that we yearly get together and try to figure out, what are those issues that we want to look forward to, right, for the next biennium. And believe it or not, money in politics, was right up there. I believe it was, if not our number one issue that the coalition itself identified, it was the number two. And we've got one of our Alliance Democracy members, Judge Beck. He was actually a former member of the board for the campaign finance board, and also way back when we did the public subsidy defense work, he was one of the people that joined us way back in 2017. And it's been really awesome to see his group. He really pulled together a group, and now they're a formal 501c3. It's Clean Elections Minnesota. He's an amazing partner, and so I would actually bring him into that work as well, and also our extended network of other allies in money and politics. So we definitely have the grassroots capacity to start thinking about, well, what is the campaign going to look like? And like I said before, all of our work is grassroots. So it's all about planning that education piece, right? That getting the ground ready, trying to empower people like Judge Beck that already know the work. And so how could we help his group help us start getting that, right? Partnering with Governor Carlson. Who else can we bring from the national with Beth, and maybe another national figure that can host a Zoom? So you see, we try to think of ways that really get people to start asking those questions for themselves. So sort of like how the governor's been kind of coming to us and saying, hey, have you thought about this? Why can't I get a hearing? Why can't I? We have the same approach in Minnesota, because what I said before is that what I'm learning is particularly in our disenfranchised communities, particularly in our communities of color, because as Governor Carlson spoke to with regards to water quality issues and other environmental issues, we all know, right? We all know where the special interest comes in and which communities are actually disparately impacted by some of these environmental problems and issues, air quality, water quality, right? Even in our farmers. I was just listening to public radio the other day, and our corporate farms are literally choking the life out of our family, multi-generational, farmers in resources at the Capitol, and who, like, they're able to just get an appointment with the governor's office, and they're able to just sit there and say, well, this is what we need, this is what we need, this is what we need. And when legislators are not able to have that, I'm sorry, Governor, go ahead.
Yeah. I think what we have to do is we understand the problem. Where in God's name are the candidates? That's what bothers me. Out of the millions and millions of people in Minnesota, we should have a dozen or so that are willing to come forth and challenge. And that's what we need more than anything else. Now, I think Richard Painter from the law school at the University of Minnesota is going to run as an independent candidate for governor. And if he were to run, he's going to run on the platform you and I are discussing. That's going to be a good vehicle. But we need others. We need people to come forth, because the honest truth is you can draft the best bill that has ever been written in the history of mankind, and you're going to run up to the exact same wall that we're running up against now, and you won't get a single hearing, not one.
And how do we avoid this being about ideology? Because all the challenges, frankly, within the Democratic Party now,
it's about protecting democracy. It's about
absolutely, but that's my point, Governor. My point is that we've got to change the way these things get looked at, because right now it is being looked at through a partisan lens. All right, and that's what has to change.
Yeah, but again, we're going to the problem. Let's go back to old New York City. 100% dominated by Democrats who were run by Tammany Hall. That was basically one of the most corrupt political organizations in the history of the United States. A handful of reform Republicans led by Fiorello LaGuardia took them on and beat them. Mm-hmm. It's candidates who do it, candidates who can mobilize public opinion, candidates who get the public's attention. We need to personify this. And that's what we're not doing. We're intellectualizing among ourselves, and we're commiserating with each other. Let me tell you about the hard work I'm doing to try to get something done. But in the end, you have secret meetings in St. Paul. The public is left out. 90% of the legislature is left out. And then we're stuck with the results.
Yeah.
So let's go out and see if we can encourage some candidates to run and take the incumbents on and throw them out.
And Beth, you'll be a resource for us in this effort in the national office.
Very much so. And that's where Common Cause is very instrumental.
Absolutely.
As a supportive organization from which candidates can spring out of.
Well, and Paul, to your question and to the governor's comments, I think a part here that we really need to emphasize is people.
Right.
And to the governor's point about, if we don't have the candidates, if we don't have, like right now, the reason why the governor and Speaker Hortman and Senator Gazelka can get away with doing all of the behind the closed doors, wink, wink kind of things, is because the people are not there.
There's also no political challenge. We
Well,
can't.
accountability is that, though.
No,
Accountability
no,
for common cause, anyway. It's accountability. Is key, right? I mean, you can't, because this is what happens, Governor Carlson, and you were the one actually who kind of opened my eyes to this. No matter how good intended a candidate is going into that chamber, in a couple of years, they are going to be whipped right in line with whatever leadership wants done because of the money. So it can't just be about getting in a candidate that's willing to take up the fight. It's got to also be about having the people hold Melissa Hortman and Paul Gazelka accountable and call them up and say what's happening when the people are not there. They think people don't care. Well, we don't. If what is it? The bosses.
I think that's a very fair question.
Well, the cat's away, the mice will play.
Okay, I think it's a very fair question. My answer to that is you publicly challenge Hortman's seat. You publicly challenge Walz's seat. You publicly challenge the seats of all those leaders who sit quietly and obey the dictates of the special interests. You take them on in a public forum, you debate them. And history is replete with people who stood out as a minority and became a majority because they brought the people on board. Gene McCarthy's movement, for instance, on the Vietnam War transformed America. And that started with a single senator. It can be done. And I just am so candidate driven. If we can get candidates in there, we will win this sucker. Because how would you like to be an incumbent, Paul, and to Anastacia too? How would you like to be an incumbent and have to defend this $230,000 number that comes from the interest groups that are being regulated by you? What's your answer?
Well, it's a great question, Governor. But one thing I want to add to the mix is there are a lot of incredibly frustrated legislators. Maybe not enough. Well, and they're frustrated for this reason, though. They actually want to get things done. They ran for the right reason, and they're being completely locked out of the process. So we need new candidates, but we also need to figure out a way to empower. There are Republicans and Democrats that are actually trying to work together, trying to get things done. But frankly, they're very intimidated by their own leaders.
With all due respect, I'm not terribly sympathetic for those people who run for public office and are intimidated by special interests.
Well,
I'm not.
They need to get over that.
Let me ask you this question: can you publicly name one?
I hope we'll be able to name more than one soon.
But honestly, can you name one?
I can name one.
Who?
I can tell you that in the Senate for a hot minute, everyone was afraid of Tom Bach because of the money he can bring in.
Oh, I don't quarrel with the.
And no matter what you wanted to do, if Tom Bach said no, it was no. And even now, I mean, even with splitting as an independent and the committee chair positions that he got in Thomasoni, I mean, all that is about power and money.
Okay, you're explaining why something can't occur, but tell me who has had the courage of the 201 legislators to go before a public microphone and take on their own caucus?
Nobody.
That's the answer. So that's why you seek people who are not part of it and challenge those people.
I don't know how many of you. Yeah, Rick Nolan and got only 6 co-authors nationally when he tried to pass a bill to prohibit congressmen from raising money directly.
Yeah.
And so 429 of 435 congressmen apparently like spending 40 hours a week basically being a mass marketer. No, they hate it, but they were scared to death of their leadership, both parties.
I think what we're doing is we're starting to explain the problem again. That's what we like to do. I think we have some good things here. First of all, I really like the idea that several states led by Connecticut have a plan. It may not be a perfect plan, but I think one, it would be very healthy to examine it and see what pieces of it are applicable to the state of Minnesota. The second is, I think we should try to earnestly seek out candidates who are willing to run and willing to challenge the incumbents. And that's where a good, healthy public contest is what democracy is about. If our ideas are good, they'll prevail. And that's where I think we should leave this show.
I agree, Governor. And I think the other thing I want to leave us with is I think we should come back to this. And Governor, with Beth and Anastasia's help, I would like to bring onto this program some of the leaders of those efforts in other states and have this conversation.
That'd be wonderful.
So we'll do that. And Governor, thanks for your leadership. Beth, thanks for all you're doing.
Panel, I enjoyed it.
Wonderful. And thank you,
Absolutely.
Anastacia. And we'll do all we can to make this change. And people will be hearing a lot more from all of us and a lot of other people about this moving forward.
Good show.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Governor. And thank you, Beth and Anastacia, for your great work.